Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me today, although I don't have summer cheer for you, I'm afraid. I was thinking of how to start this speech, and wasn't it nice of the very fine English historian Andrew Roberts, who must have been thinking the same thing, to write something in today's Wall Street Journal opinion page for me, and the title of it is, "It's August, Prepare for the Cataclysm." We all think of August as a month where everybody's at the beach, we're sort of chilling out and all that, even in this heavily political season, just enjoying life. And for those of us in Washington, Congress is on recess, which generally speaking, though it means a lot of lobbyists leave town, so there's a lot less traffic. It's sort of a rather nice time. Well, Andrew Roberts wanted to bring us back to a little historical reality. So over the last century, among the peaceful events that have occurred, in August of 1914, World War I began. On the last day of August in 1939, Hitler decided to invade Poland the next day, made the final decision. In 1945, the two atomic bombs in this very week of 1945 led to the end of the Second World War. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was put up in the middle of August. In 1964, the Tonkin Gulf incident, which led to the major escalation in Vietnam, took place. In 1968, with the Prague Spring was ended when Czechoslovakia, as it was known then, was invaded by Leonid Brezhnev's order, and Soviet tanks were rolling down the streets of Prague. In 1981, an event not as dolorous, Lech Walesa started the Polish Solidarity movement. And in 1990, Saddam decided he should have 19, not 18 provinces, so he moved into Kuwait on the 2nd of August. And in 1991, just to make sure that we could round things out, that was the revolution in Russia that brought down the Gorbachev's government. It was a short-lived one, and then, of course, the revolutionaries in turn a few days later were upended. So nothing ever happens in August, sort of like that old Greta Garbo movie from 80 years ago, Grand Hotel, nothing ever happens, you know. So we can all relax and enjoy the rest of the summer. That said, what I'd like to do today is very briefly talk about why I wrote the book and what it aims to do, and then pick out three of the more pressing problems, talk about them a bit, and then wind up with overall some of the things that are particularly in this movement toward global nuclear zero. I decided 3 years ago to begin the process of writing this book because it occurred to me that there was an opportunity that I don't believe had really existed in earlier decades. What strategists had in the immediate generation after the end of the Second World War had to sort of guess at, had to imagine scenarios in the abstract. What would happen if this and if that? Now, another half century having passed since the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's enough historical experience to enable us to look at the fundamental problems that nuclear weapons have posed in the 2/3 of a century that they have been part of, and since they changed the world forever. The first explosion in New Mexico. And therefore, we could take an integrated look at these problems, a high-level look, and delve into detail where necessary for illustration, but present an integrated and coherent set of problems and what lessons we can learn from them. And there is an umbrella lesson, a 12th lesson at the end that I come up with, which is that the fundamental thrust of nuclear policy is to avoid what I call the apocalyptic trinity. And the apocalyptic trinity is that of genocide, suicide, or surrender. You always want to have non-apocalyptic choices. And I'll return to that a couple of times during my remarks. But there's also maybe a 13th lesson, which is never write a book with more than 3 lessons. But in any event, with that, I wanted to pick out 3 areas from what I cover and talk about some of the illustrative problems there that are particularly pressing, and then turn to the umbrella problem, as it were, of nuclear zero. I'm hoping that the book, by the way, is of use to laypersons, is also to a lot of policymakers who haven't had experience, and even of some use perhaps here and there to those who have. But it's specifically, I try to bring this to the general public in a way that I think really hasn't been possible before, because now we've got concrete examples to illustrate things, which rather than talk about abstractions. So I would say that the 3 problems I'm going to focus on today are the problem Iran poses, the problem that India and Pakistan have posed, Iran's being the problem of a revolutionary state in pursuit of nuclear weapons, the problem with Pakistan and India being civilian energy as a springboard for getting to nuclear weapons. And the third one, a specialized problem of small power vulnerability as evidenced by what is called electromagnetic pulse. I'll talk about that when we get to it. And the implications for missile defense. And then from then I'll move on and just conclude. In the case of Iran, which I think we can say is every now and then in the news. And I saw just yesterday a story about will Israel deliver an October surprise. The fundamental problem here is the possibility of a Cuban Missile Crisis in the Middle East. And to understand this, we briefly go back to what Nikita Khrushchev had in mind. Khrushchev, in 1961, met in June with President Kennedy in Vienna. And he pushed Kennedy around. Kennedy himself said later, he really beat me up. He decided that Kennedy was not up to it. Kennedy said, well, what about the possibility, I'm paraphrasing, not having the transcript in front of me, what about the possibility of miscalculation? We have to be careful. And Khrushchev said, miscalculation, miscalculation. I don't want to hear this word miscalculation. I'm tired of hearing it. So in 1961, Khrushchev decided, partly, mainly because of the summit, that he could push Kennedy a little further. So what he did was, working with the East German leader, they began the Berlin Wall, which was a flat violation of the 1945 Four-Power Agreement, which gave full access to all 4 occupying parties. And then we saw the second shoe drop in October of 1962, which many of us lived through. I was 15 years old, and all of the jocular conversation on the school bus at that time was considerably more subdued for a couple of weeks. It was very real to us. We didn't find out till much later how close we came to nuclear war. And then what we saw there was that Kennedy and Khrushchev realized right off the bat that there was a possibility that this thing would get out of hand. Khrushchev had expected Kennedy, as Khrushchev told his son Sergei, who was a young missileer, he said, he'll make a fuss, he'll make more of a fuss and then agree. That was not Nikita Khrushchev's best calculation. And a couple of years after that, the Politburo decided he had made one too many miscalculations. And what happened there was that at the same time, and this was Jeffrey Goldberg interviewed Fidel Castro a couple of years ago, and Castro admitted that he had wanted a first strike against the United States. And at the time, the gist of the conversation Moscow had with him was, if this happens, do you know what is going to happen to your island? It is going to disappear and you with it. And Castro still wanted them to go ahead. It is also reported that about 20 years later, Castro renewed the request in Moscow.